All right, Alexander, let's talk about the Russian economy. Let's do an update video on how things are going in Russia and how is their economy moving along, Alexander. Continued
Well,
growth, huh?
well, we've had more economic figures coming from Russia. 5% GDP growth so far this year, apparently. It's unlikely to remain at that level through the whole year. It will fall, not because economic activity is declining, economic activity remains incredibly strong, but because statistically we're going to have the base effect soon. And there was a big economic surge in June of 2023. So we're no longer going to be comparing the growth of the economy with the quieter conditions in the first half of 2023. We're going to be comparing the conditions that existed in the more busy and active part of the later part of 2023. But everybody now expects at least 3% growth this year, probably more than that. So a rising, growing economy. Um, I was reading somewhere that I think it was in Politico that the Biden team are telling everybody that the Russians can only sustain this war economy that they supposedly have for about 3 to 4 years, and then the sanctions will start to bite and it will all fall apart. I really cannot see why anybody thinks that. The financial position is getting stronger. Budget deficit was 0.5% in the period from January to June. So, 0.5%, practically an accounting error, if I have to be frank. And as I said, high growth, strong budget deficit figures, um, a declining level of debt. Debt is actually falling within the economy overall. And within the 5% GDP figures, continuing investment and manufacturing surge. Manufacturing grew by 9% in the period to the end of May. So, all the indications are an economy that's improving and getting stronger. And we've now had two studies. Well, one important study by apparently a Japanese exporters group. We're now saying straight out that the sanctions have failed and that the economy is now performing very strongly and will continue to, and that it is now in a virtuous circle of growth. There was an equally, even more positive survey by BNE Intelligence. BNE is a magazine that looks at the economies of Eastern Europe, and they're also talking about the Russian economy now being in a situation of a virtuous circle, where growth leads to higher investment, which leads to higher growth. So this is the sort of way the economy is performing. And even the Financial Times over the weekend had a big feature showing how even the poorer regions of Russia are now getting wealthier. And I think it was either the IMF or the World Bank have now officially reclassified Russia as a high income country. So sanctions, as we see, have been a brilliant success. I should add that exports remain very strong. No sign of any major reduction in exports, and that's translating in, as I said, the budget deficit figures, which also look very, very well under control. So the economy doing well, and the Russians themselves somewhat surprised about this. They continue to be surprised, but you can sense that their own confidence is growing. I forgot to mention that inflation has been higher this year than the central bank had hoped. But over the last 2 weeks, there's been finally signs that inflation has peaked and is starting to fall.
Janet Yellen also told the Congress the other day that sanctions in general, sanctions against other countries, has also been a complete failure and has actually undermined the strength and the reliability, the trust of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. Quite an admission
Yeah.
from Yellen, who was the architect of many of these sanctions policies. I mean,
Yeah. Yes, but
what do you make of that? Wasn't she the one that put together the oil price cap?
yes, it was. It was
Wasn't
her
that
idea.
her?
That
Yeah.
was her idea. Absolutely. I mean, she's stating the obvious. She's about 2 years, well, more than 2 years behind the Duran. Just saying, this is the U.S. Treasury Secretary, with vast bureaucracies and huge intelligence um, information provided to her, and access to vast banks of economic thinking, and she's finally come round to the sort of things we've been saying for the last 3 years. But there we go. So she's saying it. But notice that even as she's saying it, she's not actually proposing any change of policy, because, of course, doing that would be politically very, very controversial. There's no word that the United States is prepared to reverse course. On the contrary, all the rhetoric that we're hearing from the US is of sanctions escalation, tightening of sanctions against Russia, even though the sanctions aren't working against Russia, as we've seen, and of extending sanctions against China as well. And as we discussed in a program we did a little while back, they're now ready to start imposing sanctions against Chinese banks and financial institutions, and they've got the right to do that with secondary sanctions. And the Treasury Department apparently wanted sanctions against the Russian oil fleet as well, the oil tanker fleet, and that was only stopped by the Biden administration because they were worried that would cause the oil price to rise and that would affect the president's prospects of re-election. So, I mean, they're still pressing for more and more sanctions. They're still going to continue doing that which they acknowledge now has failed and which is undermining the position of the dollar. So that's what, they're not changing course. So it's interesting that Yellen can see this, but she's not prepared to change course. She's perhaps providing herself with a kind of alibi for when things go wrong, but she's not prepared to come out and say, this whole sanctions policy has been a terrible mistake and must be reconsidered.
I don't understand why they just don't stop the sanctioning. Europe and the United States. It's not like anyone would notice, like voters or any people going about their day to day lives would notice that the sanctions had stopped. They just stop announcing a 15th sanctions package or a 17th sanctions package. They just don't mention it anymore. Is it that hard to do? But instead, they feel compelled to
Yeah.
place sanctions, knowing that sanctions help the Russian economy to grow, knowing that the sanctions hurt the dollar, hurt the United States, hurt the European Union, and they make them look ridiculous as well. It makes people like Janet Yellen and Ursula and all of these very smart globalist leaders. It makes them look absolutely ridiculous. Janet Yellen demanding the $60 oil price cap, and 2 years later having to admit that the sanctions are a complete failure to all of Congress. Why don't they just stop? Just stop and now just stop talking about it. Just don't mention it anymore, and you're done with
Well,
it.
because you're dealing with people who are in the grip of an obsession. And of course, admitting to themselves that the sanctions don't work by actually stopping sanctions would be to admit that the period of unchallenged Western economic hegemony has passed. And, Yellen can talk in this way and, make rhetorical comments to that effect, but translating that into action and by, sort of lifting or relaxing sanctions, making that kind of admission, if you like, um, in a way that would be an admission of defeat and which would be irreversible. It's more than they can bring themselves to do. So even though they know that it's failed, they're just going to go on doing it.
And MBS also put an end to the whole 300 billion asset confiscation talk as well, though.
Yes,
Saudi Arabia, MBS.
absolutely, absolutely. But you still want to pretend to yourself that you're the masters of the universe, that you have the absolute world hegemony, that you are um, you know working through your great globalist neocon project. If you've invested as much intellectually and mentally and emotionally and viscerally as these people have done, you can't just let it go. And the other thing is, doing that, reversing the sanctions, you're absolutely right. Most people wouldn't notice and wouldn't care. But amongst the little group that makes these decisions, some, of course, they would notice. And you'd get the angry articles in the Foreign Policy and the Financial Times and the Guardian as well. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to seem to lose face with each other.
Children.
Oh, they
They're
are.
children.
They are
They're
absolute
children,
children.
yeah.
They are absolute children. I mean, they cannot reverse a policy which everybody can see has failed, and which the more intelligent amongst them, which Yellen is, admit have failed, but they can't reverse it. They have to go on. They're going to continue to be led by the likes of Kaya Kallas. And, that's where we are. Kaya
All right.
Kallas
Anything else to say?
Kaya
Yeah.
Kallas is now the true leader of the West. Just saying. I mean, that's the quality of
Scary.
person who is now
Oh
really
my
in
God.
charge.
Oh my God. Yeah. Uh, an opportunist. That's what she is.
Oh,
She's an
absolutely,
opportunist. Yeah. She's a
absolutely.
globalist opportunist. Yeah. Anything else that you want to say? Maybe a little bit more about the Russian economy or.
Well, it is now, as I said, contrary to what some people are saying. I mean, I not only not do not expect this period of growth to end in 3, 4, 7, 10 years. I would say that, on the contrary, we are now on the brink of a very lengthy period of rapid Russian economic expansion. The World Bank has now basically said that Russia's real economy, its GDP on a purchasing power parity is, well, they say $6.7 trillion, but they admit that with around 40% of it below the surface, it's more like $10 trillion. I think that we're going to see Russia move very quickly into not just become a much bigger, heavily industrialized technological economy, but one of the big economies of the world, um, up there with the United States, China, perhaps India too, and the Western economies, the European economy, the Japanese economy, will fall further and further behind.
That must be a terrible reality for the EU leaders to come to grips with. The
Well,
fact that
indeed.
the Russian economy is bigger than all of the EU economies, bigger than the German economy, bigger than the French economy, bigger than the British economy. That must be
Well,
a real bitter pill to swallow for all these guys.
even more bitter will be the fact that, with the admission that Russia is now a high-income country, the moment when it becomes impossible any longer to deny that living standards in Russia are as high or even higher than in Western Europe, that psychologically is something that is going to transform the whole way of thinking of in Europe and across the West. Um, the moment that happens, at no point in modern history have we had a situation where the average Russian was richer than the average Frenchman or uh, Briton or German. When we get to that position, which I think we will, by the way, I think that is absolutely the trajectory we're heading towards. When that happens, I mean, it will be. It is impossible to understate the psychological effect uh, that will have in Europe and, of course, in Russia as well.
All right, we will end it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop. Pick up some limited edition merch. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.